Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. I said no, Miss Morgan. Jacob Mercer's weathered hand tightened on the rifle as he stood in his doorway, the setting sun casting harsh shadows across the deep scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Sarah's face crumpled, but then her chin lifted with that familiar defiance he'd come to recognize. Please, I have nowhere else. Find somewhere else. His voice was granite, final. But even as he spoke those words, something in her green eyes made his chest tighten in a way it hadn't for 23 years. Something that reminded him of laughter he'd lost in the blood and mud of Gettysburg. Now let me take you back 3 days earlier to when this broken-down war veteran's world got turned upside down by a woman with fire in her spirit and desperation in her heart. The September heat in Silver Creek, Montana was merciless as always. Dust devils dancing down Main Street like ghosts of all the dreams that died in this forsaken corner of the territory. I've lived in these parts long enough to know that nothing good ever came on the afternoon stage. And that day in 1887 was no different. Well, that's what I thought anyway. Jacob Mercer had been standing in the shadows outside Henderson's general store, avoiding conversation as usual, when the stage rolled in with its cargo of disappointment and broken promises. He'd seen it all before, big time. Desperate men chasing gold that wasn't there, women fleeing lives back east, snake oil salesmen with their bottles of hope. But when Sarah Elizabeth Morgan stepped down from that dusty coach, her dark hair escaping its pins and her traveling dress wrinkled beyond salvation, something stirred in Jake's chest that he'd thought died at Bull Run. She stood there in the street, clutching a carpet bag like it held her entire world, green eyes scanning the handful of weathered buildings that made up Silver Creek's main thoroughfare, looking for someone who wasn't coming. Jake had learned to read desperation in a person's posture during his years of solitude. This woman wore it like a second skin. The thing about broken people is they recognize each other instantly, even across a dusty street. Sarah Morgan had been standing in that merciless Montana sun for near an hour, her letter of introduction growing damp in her palm when she finally accepted the truth. Thomas Whitmore, her supposed husband-to-be, wasn't coming. The man who'd promised her a new life, a teaching position, a fresh start, he was nothing but ink on paper and lies wrapped in pretty words. She traveled 1,800 miles from Boston with her last $7, fleeing a stepfather whose hands wandered and debts that followed like hungry wolves. Now here she stood, stranded in a town that looked like God had forgotten it existed, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. That's when she noticed him. The man leaning against the general store's weathered porch had been watching her with eyes the color of storm clouds. Even in the shadow of his hat brim, she could see the jagged scar that marked the left side of his face like a map of old violence. His clothes were clean but worn, his posture alert despite his casual stance against the post. He looked like a man who understood disappointment. "Excuse me, sir." Sarah approached him with what remained of her dignity intact. "I'm looking for Thomas Whitmore. Do you know him?" The scarred man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. "Whitmore pulled out 2 weeks ago, owed money to half the town, left with a saloon girl and his tail between his legs." Sarah's heart sank to her boots, but she kept her chin up. 24 years of surviving her stepfather's house had taught her not to let weakness show. "I see. Is there perhaps a hotel where I might—" "No hotel." His voice carried a gravelly quality, like he didn't use it much. "Mrs. Patterson takes in boarders sometimes, but she's visiting family in Helena till next month." The last of Sarah's hope crumbled like autumn leaves. She looked around the empty street, at the handful of rough men lounging outside the saloon, at the vast emptiness of the Montana territory stretching beyond the town limits. $7 wouldn't get her far, and certainly wouldn't get her back to Boston. "Is there any work to be had?" she asked, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. "I can teach, keep books, cook, clean. Not for a lady like you." Something in his tone made her look at him sharper. This wasn't dismissal, it was warning. The saloon doors swung open and three men stumbled out, their eyes immediately fixing on Sarah like wolves spotting a lost lamb. That's when she realized just how much trouble she was truly in. A woman alone learns to read danger in men's eyes the way sailors read storms in the sky. Well, the tallest of the three men drawled, his words slurred with whiskey and bad intentions. "What have we got here?" Sarah's hand tightened on her carpet bag as the men approached. She'd seen that look before in her stepfather's drinking friends, predators who mistook desperation for opportunity. "Afternoon, Dalton." The scarred man straightened from his casual lean, and suddenly the space around him seemed charged like air before lightning. "These gentlemen bothering you, miss?" Sarah noticed he hadn't moved closer, but somehow his presence filled the street. "I was just asking about work opportunities." "Work?" Dalton laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Oh, we got work for a pretty little thing like you. Real good work. Pays well, too." The other men chuckled, and Sarah's stomach turned. She'd heard similar offers back in Boston, knew exactly what kind of work they meant. "That's enough." The scarred man's voice carried a quiet authority that made all three men pause. "Ladies not interested in whatever you're selling." "Now, Mercer," Dalton's tone turned mocking, "ain't nobody talking to you. Mind your own business like you always do." So this was Jacob Mercer. Sarah had heard the name whispered in the general store, a war veteran who lived alone in the mountains, came to town only for supplies, minded his own affairs. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was just broken. Looking at him now, Sarah thought maybe he was both. "She is my business." Mercer stepped forward, finally, and Sarah saw the way his hand rested easy near the gun at his hip. Not threatening, just ready. "Seeing as how she's my new housekeeper." Sarah's eyes widened, but she had enough sense to keep quiet. Whatever game Mercer was playing, it was keeping her safe from these wolves. Dalton's expression darkened. "Your housekeeper? Since when do you—" "Since now, son." Mercer's gray eyes never wavered. "You boys got somewhere else to be." It wasn't a question. For a long moment, the street held its breath. Then Dalton spat in the dust and jerked his head at his companions. "Come on, let's get a drink." As they swaggered back toward the saloon, Sarah heard one mutter, "Crazy old soldier thinks he's still fighting the war." When they were gone, Sarah turned to face her unlikely savior. Up close, she could see that the scar was old, probably from the war, and that his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much darkness. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though I should point out that you may have just hired a housekeeper you don't actually need." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I do need one. And maybe I need the work more than I need the truth about how this arrangement came to be." This time he almost did smile. "Jacob Mercer. Most folks call me Jake." "Sarah Morgan. Most folks back in Boston called me foolish for coming west." "Well, Sarah Morgan," Jake picked up her carpet bag without asking. "Looks like we're both about to find out if they were right." But as they walked toward his horse and wagon, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob Mercer was harboring secrets as deep and dark as the scar across his face. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone who has nothing left to lose. The ride to Jake's ranch took them through terrain that seemed carved by God's own hand, rolling hills that stretched toward snow-capped peaks, valleys thick with pine and aspen, creeks that ran clear and cold from mountain springs. Sarah had never seen country so wild or so beautiful. Jake drove in silence, which suited her fine. She needed time to think about what she'd gotten herself into. His ranch sat in a natural meadow about 5 miles from town, protected by a ring of hills and fed by a stream that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. The house was solid timber construction, built to last, with a wide porch and windows that caught the light. Outbuildings included a barn, a smokehouse, and what looked like a workshop. It was the kind of place a man built when he intended to stay forever. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as Jake helped her down from the wagon. "It's remote." He set her carpet bag on the porch. "Nearest neighbor is 12 miles south. Town's the only civilization for 50 miles in any direction." She heard the warning in his words. "Are you trying to frighten me, Mr. Mercer?" Just want you to understand what you're signing up for. And what exactly am I signing up for? Jake turned those storm gray eyes on her, and Sarah felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Honest work for honest pay, room and board, respect for your privacy in person. In exchange, you help with cooking, cleaning, mending, maybe help with the books if you're good with numbers. I taught mathematics at Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies. Before she trailed off, before her stepfather's gambling debts forced the school to let her go, for Thomas Whitmore's letters promised salvation that turned out to be smoke and mirrors. Before you came west chasing a dream that turned to dust, Jake finished. I know something about that. He led her inside, and Sarah was surprised by what she found. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted. The floors were clean, everything was tidy and well-maintained. This wasn't the lair of a hermit. It was the home of a man who took pride in his surroundings. You'll have the back bedroom, Jake said, pointing down a short hallway. Door has a lock if that makes you more comfortable. It did, though she didn't say so. What happened to your last housekeeper? Never had one. Been managing on my own for 23 years. Then why now? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been grief. Maybe I'm tired of the quiet. That night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind whisper through the pines, she wondered what had happened to Jacob Mercer during the war. What had carved that scar across his face and that deeper scar across his soul? And why did a man who claimed to be tired of quiet still speak in whispers, as if he was afraid his voice might wake the dead? The best way to learn someone's character is to watch how they handle their morning barbie and their evening sorrows. Sarah woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable, and made her way to the kitchen. Jake stood at the stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pan. He'd already been outside, she could tell. His boots were dusty, and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with old scars. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Morning, he said without turning around. Coffee's on the table. Thank you. Sarah poured herself a cup and inhaled the rich aroma. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd grown used to back in Boston. What can I do to help? Can you make biscuits? My mother's recipe was quite good. For the first time since she'd met him, Jake's smile was real. My grandmother's was terrible, but it's all I know how to make. They worked together in comfortable silence, Sarah mixing dough while Jake tended to the eggs and bacon. She found herself stealing glances at his hands as he worked. They were scarred but capable, gentle with the fragile eggshells. You fought in the war, she said. It wasn't a question. Most men my age did. Which battles? Jake's hands stilled for just a moment. Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg. Each name fell like a stone into dark water. You asking because you lost someone? My brother David, Chancellorsville. They stood in the warm kitchen, bound together by the weight of old grief. Sarah had learned not to speak of David much. His death had broken their mother's heart and driven their father to drink himself into an early grave, leaving her at the mercy of her mother's second husband. I'm sorry, Jake said simply. He was 19, wanted to be a teacher like me after the war. Sarah shaped the biscuit dough with perhaps more force than necessary. Instead, he died in some field in Virginia, fighting for causes he barely understood. We all died a little in those fields. Jake's voice was quiet. Some of us just kept breathing afterward. The biscuits came out golden and perfect, and they ate breakfast as the sun painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Sarah learned that Jake raised horses, beautiful animals that he gentled with patience rather than breaking with force. He'd built this ranch from nothing, carved it out of wilderness with his own hands. Why here, she asked. Why so far from everything? Jake looked out the window toward the mountains. War taught me that most people can't be trusted with power over others. Out here, the only person who can hurt you is yourself. That seems like a lonely way to live. Lonely's better than dead. After breakfast, Sarah explored the house properly. Jake had built it to last. Thick walls, solid floors, windows that let in light while keeping out the wind. The books on his shelves surprised her. Poetry, philosophy, even some novels. This wasn't the collection of an uneducated mountain man. "You read Shakespeare?" she asked, pulling out a worn copy of Hamlet. "My mother was a teacher, insisted I get an education before I got myself shot full of holes." Jake appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'll be working with the horses today. Holler if you need anything." As he walked toward the barn, Sarah noticed a slight hitch in his left leg and wondered what other wounds he carried, the ones that didn't show on the surface. But there was something else she noticed too, the way the morning light caught in his gray eyes when he'd almost smiled at her biscuits, the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. Sarah Morgan had come west looking for security, but standing in Jacob Mercer's kitchen, she realized she might have found something much more dangerous instead. The hardest truths are the ones we tell ourselves in the mirror each morning, pretending they don't cut like broken glass. 3 days into her new life, Sarah had established a routine that felt almost normal. She rose before dawn, made coffee and breakfast, tended to the house while Jake worked with his horses, prepared dinner, and spent her evenings reading by lamplight while Jake worked on his ledgers or maintained his equipment. It was peaceful in a way her life had never been before. But peace, Sarah had learned, was often just the quiet before the storm. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Jake emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, his posture alert and dangerous. 3 riders crested the hill, and Sarah's heart sank when she recognized the leader. Dalton. "Afternoon, Mercer," Dalton called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Thought we'd pay a social call, check on your new housekeeper." Jake didn't lower his rifle. "You're on private property, Dalton. State your business or move along." "Now that ain't very neighborly." Dalton's gaze found Sarah, and she forced herself not to step back. "We just wanted to make sure the lady's being treated proper. Sometimes these isolated situations can get complicated." "The lady's fine," Jake said evenly, "as you can see." "Can we, though?" One of Dalton's companions spoke up. "Maybe we should ask her ourselves." Sarah walked closer to Jake, close enough to smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that seemed to cling to him. "I'm perfectly well. Thank you for your concern. Now, as Mr. Mercer said, you're on private property." Dalton's smile turned ugly. "Funny thing, though. Been asking around about you, Miss Morgan. Real interesting what a man can find out if he knows the right people to ask." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, not Morgan, stepdaughter of Cornelius Hartwell of Boston. Man's got quite a debt hanging over his head, enough that he'd pay good money to know where his missing stepdaughter ended up." The world tilted sideways. Sarah heard Jake's sharp intake of breath, felt his eyes on her face. "Now I'm thinking," Dalton continued, "a smart businessman might be able to work out some kind of arrangement. Help reunite a family, so to speak. For the right price, of course." "Get off my land." Jake's voice was deadly quiet. "Or what? You'll shoot us?" Dalton laughed. 3 against 1, Mercer. Even a war hero has to know those odds." 3 against 2, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She moved to Jake's side, chin lifted in defiance. "And I'd rather die in this dirt than go back to that house." Something flickered in Jake's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "You heard the lady. Now get the hell off my property before I decide to see if I remember how to fight a war." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the pines and the creak of leather as horses shifted restlessly. Then Dalton shrugged. "We'll be in touch, Mercer. You think about what's best for everyone involved." He wheeled his horse around. "Especially what's best for your pretty little housekeeper." As the riders disappeared over the hill, Sarah realized she was trembling. Not from fear, from rage. "Sarah," Jake's voice was gentle. "We need to talk." But Sarah was already walking toward the house, her back straight and her fists clenched. The truth was out, and there would be hell to pay for it. Truth has a way of changing everything, even when you thought you were prepared for it. Sarah sat at Jake's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Across from her, Jake waited with the patience of a man who'd learned that silence could be as powerful as words. My real name is Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. My stepfather, Cornelius, gambled away everything we had. When the creditors came calling, he suggested I might help work off the debt in ways that no decent woman would consider. Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I took what little money I could find and bought passage west. The letters from Thomas Whitmore seemed like a godsend, a teaching position, a chance at respectability, marriage to a decent man. Sarah laughed bitterly. I should have known it was too good to be true. How much does he owe? Jake asked quietly. $1,500. Might as well be $15,000 for all the hope I have of paying it. And if Dalton contacts him? Sarah met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. Cornelius will come for me, or send someone who will. Men like him don't let their property walk away. Property. The word hung between them like a curse. You're not property, Jake said, his voice rough with anger. You're not going back to him. You don't understand what kind of man he is, what he's capable of. I understand plenty about what men are capable of. Jake stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the pasture where his horses grazed peacefully. Question is, what are you willing to do to stop him? Sarah stared at his back, at the set of his shoulders and the way his hands clenched at his sides. What do you mean? Marry me. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? Jake turned around and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. If we're legally married, he has no claim on you. You'd be under my protection, my name, my responsibility. Jake, you can't. I can and I am. He moved closer and Sarah caught that scent of leather and wood smoke again, mixed with something that was purely him. It would be a real marriage, legal and binding. But it would be whatever you wanted it to be beyond that. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Why would you do this? You barely know me. I know enough. Jake's voice was gentle now, but no less certain. I know you make better biscuits than I do. I know you're not afraid of hard work. I know you'd rather die than compromise your honor. And I know you read Shakespeare in gentle horses instead of breaking them, Sarah whispered. I know you carry scars from a war that ended 20 years ago. And I know you've been alone so long that you've forgotten how to trust anyone. Maybe it's time I remembered. They stared at each other across the small kitchen, two broken people offering each other the only shelter they could provide. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something stronger than desperation and more honest than convenience. If we do this, Sarah said carefully, it has to be your choice as much as mine. Not just because you feel sorry for me, or because you think you owe me protection. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. Sarah, I haven't felt this alive since before the war. Whatever this is between us, pity ain't part of it. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, like a bird testing wings long forgotten. When? Tomorrow. Preacher comes through Silver Creek once a month. He'll be at the church tomorrow morning. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley again. But this time there were more than 3 riders approaching. When your past comes calling, it never knocks politely on the front door. Sarah peered through the lace curtains of the front window and felt her blood turn to ice. 6 riders this time, led by a man in an expensive suit who sat his horse like he owned everything he surveyed. Even at a distance, she recognized the cruel set of his shoulders, the way he held his head. Cornelius Hartwell had come calling. Sarah. Jake's voice was calm, but she could hear the steel beneath it. Get my shotgun from the bedroom closet. Load it. You remember how I showed you? She nodded, her mouth too dry for words. 3 days ago, Jake had taught her to shoot, claiming every frontier woman should know how to defend herself. At the time, she thought it was just practical wisdom. Now she understood it had been preparation for war. Stay inside unless I call for you, Jake continued, checking his rifle. No matter what you hear, no matter what he says, you stay put until I tell you different. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was her fight, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This was Jake the soldier, Jake the protector, and he wouldn't be swayed by reason or sentiment. She retrieved the shotgun with hands that shook only slightly, loaded it the way he'd taught her, and positioned herself where she could see the front yard through a crack in the curtains. Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The sight of him, steady and immovable as the mountains themselves, gave Sarah strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Afternoon," Jake called out. "You're on private property." Cornelius Hartwell dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to having others hold his horse. In his 50s, silver-haired and handsome in a way that had fooled Sarah's mother years ago, he carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no from anyone who mattered. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it?" Cornelius's voice was cultured, educated, the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms and bent politicians to his will. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Don't believe I do." "My stepdaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell. I've been terribly worried about her since she disappeared from Boston." Jake's stance didn't change, but Sarah could see the tension coiling in his shoulders. "No one here by that name." "Come now, Mr. Mercer. We're both civilized men. Surely we can resolve this without unpleasantness." Cornelius gestured to his companions, hard men with dead eyes and guns worn low on their hips. "I simply want to take my poor, confused stepdaughter home where she belongs. And I simply want you off my land before I lose what little patience I have left." Cornelius's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold predator beneath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, soldier boy. I have money, influence, connections. I can make your life very difficult. And you have no idea who you're dealing with either." Jake's voice carried a quiet menace that made Sarah shiver. "I've killed better men than you for lesser reasons. The war taught me that some people ain't worth the air they breathe." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise, though." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 6 men against 1, civilization against wilderness, past against future. Sarah gripped the shotgun tighter, ready to stand with Jake against the darkness that had followed her west. Then Cornelius smiled, and Sarah knew they were in more trouble than she'd imagined. "No need for violence, Mr. Mercer. I'm a reasonable man. Name your price. Money can't buy everything, but it can rent loyalty long enough to destroy what matters most." "My price?" Jake's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "You think everything's for sale, don't you, Hartwell? In my experience, everything is." Cornelius pulled a leather wallet from his jacket, thick with bills. $500. Surely that's more than a frontier housekeeper is worth. "She's not my housekeeper," Jake said quietly. "She's my wife." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah's heart stopped, then began hammering double time. He'd claimed her, protected her with the strongest bond frontier law recognized. Cornelius's mask slipped further. "Impossible. Sarah would never." "Sarah Hartwell is dead," Jake continued, his voice carrying the finality of a gravestone. "Sarah Mercer is alive and under my protection. Now get off my land before I decide to dig 6 graves in my back pasture." "You can't be serious." But Cornelius was looking at Jake with new eyes, seeing perhaps what Sarah had learned to recognize, a man who'd walked through hell and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. Deadly serious. Jake took a step forward, and Sarah saw Cornelius's hired guns tense. "You've got 10 seconds to mount up and ride out. After that, we'll see if you bleed the same color as decent folks." For a heartbeat, Sarah thought Cornelius might back down. Then his face twisted with rage and something uglier than mere greed. "You think this is over? I'll be back with the law, with federal marshals. I'll claim you kidnapped her, forced her into marriage. Your word against mine, and who do you think they'll believe? A respected businessman or a broken-down soldier living like a hermit in the mountains?" Sarah had heard enough. She stepped onto the porch, shotgun in her hands, chin raised in defiance that would have made her brother David proud. "They'll believe what I tell them," she said clearly, "that I came west of my own free will, that I married Jacob Mercer by my own choice, that if you ever set foot on this land again, I'll shoot you myself and claim self-defense." Cornelius stared at her as if she were a stranger. In truth, she felt like one. This woman who stood fearless in the face of the monster who'd haunted her dreams for years. "You ungrateful little—" "The lady asked you to leave," Jake interrupted, his rifle now pointed squarely at Cornelius's chest. I'm asking too. Next time I won't be so polite. Cornelius remounted with jerky, furious movements. This isn't finished, Sarah. You owe me. You think you can run to the ends of the earth, but I'll find you. I'll make you pay for what you've cost me. The only thing she owes you, Jake said conversationally, is a bullet between the eyes. Keep pushing, and she might just pay that debt. As the riders thundered away, Sarah felt her knees go weak. The shotgun slipped from her nerveless fingers, and Jake caught both her and the gun before either hit the ground. You did good, he murmured against her hair. You were magnificent. Jake, she whispered, what have we done? He meant what he said. He'll be back with the law, and then we'll face it together. Jake pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes fierce and tender at once. But first, we'd better make that lie into truth. Preacher Henderson will marry us tonight if I ask him. By morning, you'll be legally Sarah Mercer in every way that matters. Sarah looked into his scarred face. This man who'd offered her everything he had to give without asking for anything in return. And what if I want to be Sarah Mercer in every way? Not just legally? Something kindled in Jake's eyes that made her pulse race. Then I guess we'd better have ourselves a real wedding night. But even as they held each other in the fading light, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Cornelius Hartwell wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully. The real battle was just beginning. Some promises are sealed with gold rings, others with gunpowder and blood. By the time Preacher Henderson finished the brief ceremony in his small cabin behind the church, the sun had set and the first stars were emerging in the vast Montana sky. Sarah stood beside Jake, her hand trembling only slightly as he slipped a simple gold band, his grandmother's, he'd told her quietly, onto her finger. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and Almighty God, the elderly preacher intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride. Jake's kiss was gentle, reverent, nothing like the brutal claiming she'd feared from men all her life. When he pulled back, his eyes held a tenderness that made her breath catch. Mrs. Mercer, he said softly, and the name felt like coming home. They rode back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Sarah's wedding dress, her good blue traveling dress, really, but it felt bridal in the moonlight, spread carefully across the wagon seat. Jake had brought his rifle, and Sarah noticed he kept scanning the darkness as they traveled. You think he'll try something tonight? She asked. Cornelius Hartwell strikes me as a man who doesn't like to wait for his revenge. Jake's voice was grim. We'd better be ready. They were 3 miles from the ranch when they smelled the smoke. No, Sarah whispered. But even as the word left her lips, they crested the hill and saw the orange glow painting the night sky. The barn was ablaze, flames reaching toward the stars like angry fingers. Jake cursed and whipped the horses into a gallop. By the time they reached the yard, the barn was fully engulfed, and Sarah could hear the terrified screaming of trapped horses. The house, Jake shouted over the roar of the flames. Check if they torched the house too. Sarah ran toward their home while Jake raced toward the barn. The house was untouched, but as she rounded the corner, she saw them. 6 shadowy figures on horseback, silhouetted against the blazing barn like devils from hell. Cornelius sat his horse in the center of the group, his face hellish in the firelight. Evening, stepdaughter, enjoying your wedding night. You bastard, Sarah screamed. The horses are learning what happens to property that doesn't know its place. Cornelius's voice was calm, conversational, just like you're about to learn. That's when Sarah heard the first gunshot. Jake had gotten 3 horses out of the burning barn before Cornelius's men opened fire. Sarah watched in horror as her husband dove behind a water trough, bullets splintering the wood around him. Alive, boys, Cornelius called to his men. I want them both alive, at least long enough to watch each other suffer. Sarah ran back to the house, grabbed Jake's rifle from where he'd left it by the door, and took position at the front window. She might not be a soldier, but she'd learned to shoot straight, and by God, she was going to protect her husband. Her first shot took one of Cornelius's men clean off his horse. The lady's got teeth, someone shouted, and suddenly bullets were shattering the windows, splintering the door, turning their sanctuary into a war zone. But Sarah Mercer was no longer the frightened girl who'd fled Boston months ago. She was a frontier woman protecting her home, and she fired back with deadly precision. From behind the water trough, Jake's rifle barked steadily, each shot carefully aimed. Between them, they kept the attackers at bay, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time. 6 men against 2, and nowhere to run. Then she heard the sound that chilled her blood. Cornelius's laughter rising above the gunfire. "Burn the house too, boys. Let's see how long love lasts when it's roasting alive." In the crucible of violence, you discover what you are truly made of and what you're willing to die for. The acrid smell of coal oil reached Sarah's nostrils, just as the first torch flew through the shattered front window. The curtains caught immediately, flames racing up toward the ceiling with hungry enthusiasm. "Sarah!" Jake's voice cut through the chaos. "Get out, now!" But Sarah had learned something about herself in the past few minutes of gunfire. She wasn't the kind of woman who ran while her husband stood and fought. Instead, she grabbed the water pitcher from the kitchen and doused the spreading fire, then positioned herself at the back window where she could cover Jake's retreat from the barn. Another torch sailed through the kitchen window, then another through the bedroom. Cornelius's men were surrounding the house, turning it into a funeral pyre. "Time to go," she whispered, grabbing ammunition and Jake's spare pistol. The house was lost, but they were still breathing, and that was what mattered. She burst through the back door just as Jake rolled under the fence separating the house from the pasture. A bullet splintered the doorframe where her head had been seconds before. "This way," Jake gasped, blood streaming from a graze on his temple. The creek. They ran through the darkness, Sarah's wedding dress snagging on bushes, Jake's breath coming harsh and labored. Behind them, their home burned against the night sky like a beacon of destruction. The creek was their salvation. Cold mountain water that would hide their scent and muffle the sound of their movement. They splashed upstream, fighting the current and the icy temperature, while behind them Cornelius's voice echoed through the darkness. "Find them! They can't have gone far!" Jake pulled Sarah behind a fallen log where the creek curved around a grove of aspens. They crouched in the freezing water, hardly daring to breathe, while torchlight flickered through the trees and the sound of hoofbeats thundered overhead. "Jacob Mercer!" Cornelius's voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards downstream. "You cost me a man tonight. I'm going to make you pay for that in ways that'll make you beg for death." Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, his hand moving to his gun. She touched his wrist, shaking her head. 6 against 2 were still impossible odds, even with one man down. "And Sarah, my dear stepdaughter," Cornelius continued, his cultured voice carrying easily across the water. "When I find you, and I will find you, you're going to learn what happens to property that tries to run away. I'm going to sell you to the lowest bidder, let you service cowboys and miners until you're used up and broken." Something cold and deadly settled in Sarah's chest. This man had terrorized her for years, driven her across a continent, destroyed her home and nearly killed her husband. Enough was enough. She started to rise from their hiding place, Jake's pistol in her hand, but Jake pulled her back down. "Wait," he breathed in her ear. "Listen." In the distance, Sarah heard it, the sound of many horses approaching fast from the direction of town. As they got closer, she could make out voices, rough frontier voices calling to each other. "That's Henderson," Jake whispered, "and Tom Morrison from the livery stable." The townspeople had seen the fire and come to help. Cornelius and his remaining men were suddenly outnumbered 3-1. "This ain't over," Cornelius shouted into the darkness. "You hear me, Sarah? This ain't over." But as the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the night, Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, it was. She turned to Jake in the moonlight, this man who'd risked everything to protect her, and saw her own fierce joy reflected in his eyes. They'd survived their baptism by fire, and they were still standing. Love isn't born in perfect moments. It's forged in the fires of shared struggle and tempered by unwavering trust. Dawn found Jake and Sarah huddled together in Tom Morrison's barn, wrapped in borrowed blankets and drinking coffee that tasted like salvation. The townspeople had searched through the night, but Cornelius and his men had vanished like smoke on the wind. "Burned clean to the ground," Henderson reported grimly, setting down his hat. "House, barn, everything. I'm sorry, Jake. I know how much that place meant to you. Jake's arm tightened around Sarah's shoulders. It was just wood and nails, preacher. What matters is still here. Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. In the space of one night, she'd lost everything she'd thought she wanted. Safety, security, a home, and found the one thing she'd never dared hope for. A man who valued her life above his possessions. Cornelius will be back, she said quietly. He's not the kind of man who accepts defeat. Maybe, Jake agreed. But next time we'll be ready for him. We? Sarah looked at him sharply. We. Jake's gray eyes held hers steadily. You showed me last night that you're not some fragile flower that needs protecting. You're a partner. My partner. Sheriff Williams approached their makeshift camp, his weathered face grim. Got word from the territorial marshal's office. They're sending deputies to investigate the fire and the shooting. Should be here by noon. Sarah's stomach clenched. Cornelius had threatened to bring the law down on them, to claim Jake had kidnapped and forced her into marriage. His word against theirs. A wealthy businessman against a scarred veteran and his desperate bride. Sarah, Williams continued gently, they're going to ask questions. Hard questions. You need to be ready to tell them the truth, the whole truth. I will. Sarah lifted her chin with the defiance that had become her trademark. I'll tell them that I came west of my own free will, married Jacob Mercer by my own choice, and that Cornelius Hartwell is a snake who tried to burn us alive rather than accept that he couldn't control me. Williams nodded approvingly. Good girl. Stick to the facts. Don't let them rattle you. As the morning wore on, more townspeople arrived to help. Women brought food and clothing. Men offered materials to rebuild. Sarah watched in amazement as the community rallied around them. These rough frontier folk who barely knew her, showing more kindness than her Boston society friends ever had. Witaba, she asked Mrs. Patterson, who'd returned early from Helena when she heard about the fire. Why are you all helping us? The older woman looked at her as if the question made no sense. Because you're one of us now, dear. That's what neighbors do. One of us. Sarah had never belonged anywhere, not really. Her mother's death had left her at the mercy of Cornelius. Her brother's death had isolated her from her grief-stricken father, and her escape west had made her a fugitive from her old life. But here, in this small Montana town, she was finally home. The federal deputies arrived as promised, two stern men in dusty suits who asked pointed questions and took careful notes. Sarah told her story simply and clearly, holding nothing back about Cornelius's abuse or her reasons for fleeing Boston. And you married Mr. Mercer willingly? The lead deputy asked. Eagerly, Sarah replied, and felt Jake's hand find hers. Any witnesses to the attack last night? Half the town saw the fire, Williams interjected. Found plenty of evidence, too. Coal oil tins, spent shells, horse tracks leading back toward the main road. When the deputies finally departed, Sarah felt as if she could breathe freely for the first time in months. The law was on their side. The community supported them, and Cornelius's power couldn't reach into the Montana territory. So what now? She asked Jake as they stood amid the ruins of their home. Jake surveyed the charred remains with the practical eye of a man who'd built something from nothing once before. Now we rebuild. Better this time. Stronger. Sarah looked at this man who'd lost everything to protect her and was already planning their future. Together? Jake's scarred face broke into a smile that transformed him from a wounded warrior into the man she was falling in love with. Together. The strongest foundations are built on ashes of what came before. 2 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of their new home, watching Jake work with a young stallion in the breaking pen. The house was larger than the old one, with windows that caught the morning light and a kitchen big enough for the family she was beginning to hope they might have someday. Jake had been right about rebuilding better and stronger. The new barn had stone foundations and a slate roof that wouldn't burn. The house had multiple exits and gun ports disguised as decorative shutters. They'd learned from Cornelius's attack and prepared for the possibility of another. But as the weeks passed without any sign of her stepfather, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were safe. She was hanging laundry when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her hand moved instinctively to the pistol at her hip, a habit she'd developed since the fire. but relaxed when she recognized Sheriff Williams's bay gelding. "Afternoon, Sarah," Williams called as he dismounted. "Jake around?" "In the corral." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. "Is everything all right? You look troubled." Williams's weathered face was indeed grim. "Got some news from back east about your stepfather." Jake emerged from the corral, alerted by the serious tone of the conversation. His hair was damp with sweat, his shirt sticking to his shoulders. But Sarah still felt that familiar flutter in her chest when he looked at her. "What kind of news?" Jake asked, settling his arm around Sarah's waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Cornelius Hartwell is dead." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Dead? How?" "Seems his gambling debts finally caught up with him. Tried to welch on the wrong people back in Boston. They found him in an alley near the docks, beaten to death. Williams paused, studying Sarah's face. "Federal marshals closed their investigation into the fire. Case is officially over." Sarah should have felt relief. Instead, she felt strangely empty, as if she'd been holding her breath for months and suddenly forgot how to exhale. "You all right?" Jake asked quietly. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I hated him, feared him, ran halfway across the country to escape him. And now he's just gone." "Sometimes that's how justice works," Williams said. "Not pretty, but final." That evening, Jake found Sarah sitting by the creek where they'd hidden on their wedding night. The spot had become her refuge when she needed to think, a place where the sound of running water could wash away troubled thoughts. "Regrets?" Jake asked, settling beside her on the grassy bank. "No." Sarah's answer surprised her with its certainty. "No regrets. If Cornelius hadn't been the monster he was, I never would have come west, never would have found you. Never would have learned that you were strong enough to outshoot 3 grown men and help rebuild a ranch from ashes," Jake added with a smile. "Never would have learned that some men are worth trusting with your whole heart." Jake pulled her closer, and Sarah marveled at how perfectly she fit against his side. How right it felt to be held by hands that were gentle, despite their scars. "I love you," she said simply. The words had been building inside her for weeks, but she'd been afraid to speak them. Afraid they might somehow break the fragile happiness they'd built. Jake went very still. "Sarah, I know this started as a marriage of convenience," she continued. "I know you married me to protect me, not because you wanted a wife. But these past months, building this life together, working side by side, sharing the same bed," she took a shaky breath. "I've fallen in love with you, Jacob Mercer. Completely. Hopelessly." Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fear she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he tipped her chin up, forcing her to meet his storm-gray eyes. "Sarah Mercer," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I loved you from the moment you stood up to Dalton in that dusty street. I just didn't think I deserved to keep you." And then he was kissing her, not with the gentle reverence of their wedding night, but with the passion of a man who'd finally found his way home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah smiled against his lips. "I think we're both exactly where we deserve to be. Home isn't a place on a map. It's wherever your heart feels safe enough to grow." 1 year later, Sarah stood in her garden, one hand pressed to the small swell of her belly, watching Jake and their neighbor's son work together to gentle a particularly stubborn mare. The late September sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the promise of winter on the wind. "She's a beauty," called out Mrs. Patterson, who'd come to help with the fall canning. "Due in spring?" "April," Sarah replied, unable to keep the joy from her voice. After months of hoping and praying, the baby was finally real, finally growing strong beneath her heart. Jake looked up from the corral at the sound of their conversation, and his face broke into the smile that never failed to make Sarah's pulse quicken. He was different now than the lonely, wounded man she'd first encountered. Still scarred, still capable of deadly violence when necessary, but softened by love and the promise of new life. The sound of approaching riders made both Jake and Sarah tense automatically, old habits learned in fire and blood. But these were familiar riders, Sheriff Williams and 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, though their badges marked them as federal officials. Afternoon, folks, Williams called as he dismounted. Sorry to disturb you, but these gentlemen have some news you'll want to hear. The older of the two officials, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. Mrs. Mercer, my name is Marshall Davidson. I'm here regarding Cornelius Hartwell's estate. Sarah felt Jake move closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. I want nothing from that man's estate. I understand your feelings, ma'am, but you should know that before his death, Mr. Hartwell confessed to several crimes, including embezzlement and fraud. The courts have been untangling his affairs for months. Davidson pulled out a legal document. It appears that much of what he claimed as gambling debts were actually funds he'd stolen from his business partners. The legitimate debts against your family's estate totaled less than $200. Sarah stared at the marshal in shock. 200? But he lied, ma'am, about the debts, about having the legal right to dispose of you as he saw fit. Your father's will left everything to you, including a trust fund that Mr. Hartwell had been illegally accessing for years. Jake's arm came around Sarah's shoulders as her knees went weak. How much? He asked quietly. After restitution and legal fees, approximately $8,000. $8,000. More money than Sarah had ever imagined. Certainly more than she and Jake needed for their simple life on the ranch. But it represented something far more valuable than gold. Vindication, justice for her father's memory, and proof that Cornelius's power over her had always been built on lies. There's something else, the second marshal added. We found correspondence in Hartwell's papers that suggests he'd hired men to track you down and bring you back to Boston by force. The man who burned your ranch, he was acting on Hartwell's orders, paid to make you desperate enough to return. It doesn't matter, Sarah said firmly. That life is over. This is my home now. After the marshals left, Sarah and Jake sat on their new porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, while Mrs. Patterson's cheerful chatter drifted from the kitchen where she was finishing the canning. $8,000, Jake mused, could buy a lot of breeding stock, maybe expand the operation. Or we could just put it away for the baby, Sarah suggested. Make sure our children never have to worry about money the way I did. Our children? Jake's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on her belly. Planning more than one, are we? Sarah leaned against him, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke, and the indefinable essence that was purely Jake. I'm planning whatever God sees fit to give us, as many children as want to come to this place, this life we've built. As if in response, the baby fluttered beneath her hand, the first movement she'd been able to feel. Jake's eyes widened as his palm pressed against the spot. Did you feel that? I felt it. Jake's voice was husky with wonder. Our baby, Sarah. Our child. Sarah looked out over their rebuilt ranch, at the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture, at the town lights beginning to twinkle in the valley below. A year ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing an impossible situation. Now she was Sarah Mercer, frontier wife and soon-to-be mother, surrounded by love and community and endless possibility. Jacob, she said softly, I need to tell you something. He looked at her with concern. What is it? Sarah smiled, remembering that frightened girl who'd stepped off the stage in Silver Creek with $7 and a head full of broken dreams. I'm happy, completely perfectly happy, for the first time in my entire life. Jake's scarred face creased into the smile that had won her heart, and he pulled her close as the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky. Me too, Mrs. Mercer, me too. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with two broken people learning to heal each other. 3 years have passed since that September evening, and as I write this, little David Jacob Mercer is taking his first wobbling steps across the kitchen floor, while his mother laughs and his father stands ready to catch him if he falls. Sarah's belly is round again, with their second child due before Christmas, and the joy in both their faces when they look at each other still takes my breath away. The ranch has prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Jake's horses are sought after throughout the territory, prized for their intelligence and gentle temperament, a reflection perhaps of the man who trains them with patience rather than force. Sarah has started a small school in town, teaching the children of Silver Creek the same lessons her brother David had dreamed of sharing before the war claimed him. They've built something lasting here, something that goes beyond property lines or bank accounts. They've created a legacy of love, community, and the kind of quiet courage that defines the best of the American frontier. I think often of that day when Sarah stepped off the stage, desperate and alone, looking for a man who existed only in her imagination. She came west seeking security and found something far more precious. A partner who valued her strength, honored her intelligence, and loved her fierce, independent spirit. And Jake, the wounded warrior who'd convinced himself that solitude was safer than connection, discovered that the right woman didn't diminish his strength, but amplified it. Together, they were more than the sum of their individual scars. Their story reminds us that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own, whose wounds teach you compassion, whose courage inspires your own. Sarah and Jake didn't fall in love despite their brokenness. They fell in love because of it, recognizing in each other the same determination to build something beautiful from the ruins of what came before. The West was built by people like them, not the legendary gunslingers and larger-than-life heroes of dime novels, but ordinary folks who found extraordinary strength in extraordinary circumstances. People who looked at vast, untamed wilderness and saw possibility. People who faced down their demons and chose hope over despair, love over fear. So the next time you face your own wilderness, whether it's a broken heart, a shattered dream, or simply the uncertainty of tomorrow, remember Sarah and Jake. Remember that the strongest foundations are built on ashes of what came before, that the deepest love grows from shared struggle, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust someone else with your scars. After all, we're all a little broken, all carrying wounds from battles we've fought and wars we've survived. The secret isn't in hiding those scars. It's in finding someone who sees them as proof of your strength rather than evidence of your weakness. Sarah Elizabeth Mercer learned that in a dusty Montana town, and her laughter, bright and fearless and full of joy, still echoes through the valley where she chose to make her stand. Some souls are meant to find each other, no matter how far they have to travel or how many obstacles stand in their way. Love like theirs doesn't come easy, but when it comes, it transforms everything it touches. That's the real magic of the American West. Not the gold in the ground or the cattle on the range, but the endless possibility for reinvention, for second chance, for love that's strong enough to weather any storm. If this story touched your heart the way Sarah and Jake's love story touched mine, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear that broken doesn't mean beyond repair. Subscribe for more tales from the frontier, and remember, your own love story might be just one brave choice away.